Hello there, my name is Benjamin Smith. I'm excited to share with you some of the research that we've been doing here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Now, the title for this talk is Broad-tunable multimode nonlinear generation in a warm vapor. I want to, instead of giving that ugly thing, give you a picture of what the main idea of this talk is before we go any further. And here it is. Using warm atoms, we take a microwave signal and an optical signal and convert that into an optical signal of a new frequency. That's the main idea. So I'm here representing the work of our team, myself, Professor Andal Narayanan, along with other students Bahar and Jichu, and we work under the supervision of Professor Lindsay LeBlanc. I want to give a special thank you to the Mark Freeman Lab and the John Davis Lab for giving us some sorely needed borrowed equipment as we've worked on this project and a lot of different advice as we've gone along. It's been a big help and we thank you so much for that. So we all know that physicists, you might say, have a particular affinity for Star Wars. Now, as physicists, when we look at things like this, we may notice, well, light doesn't actually interact with itself in this way, and our astro and particle friends will agree with us. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to make your own lightsaber or where to get one because they're still fictional. I'm sorry to report that. But what I will show you in this presentation is a way that light can interact with light using an auxiliary material, and this is the paradigm of nonlinear optics. So in our undergraduate optics courses, we learned that the material response to light is governed by a complex susceptibility. So there's a linear relationship between the applied electric field and the polarization of the material. And once the polarization is induced, it can re-radiate at the same frequency as the incident field. And this is governed by the linear susceptibility. In general, things are a lot more complicated. The polarization forms a power series of susceptibilities. And when a polarization is induced, it can radiate at a lot of different frequencies, the sums and differences and combinations of the incident fields. In this talk, we're going to specifically focus on this Chi2 nonlinear process, where we combine an electric and magnetic field to re-radiate at a new frequency. Now, a lot of us are familiar with nonlinear optical systems. If you ever used a laser or a laser pointer, this is a nonlinear device. Nonlinear optical device. Also, the squeezed light used in gravitational wave detectors such as LIGO are generated through a nonlinear optical process. So here are some other examples of Chi2 nonlinear systems. In our lab, we have this green laser downstairs. Behind the scenes, it's really a 1064 laser that combines through a crystal to produce this very bright 532 nanometer laser. Now, kind of the opposite process of this frequency doubling is spontaneous parametric downconversion. So this is where you send in a strong pump into a Chi2 crystal, and then it will spontaneously emit pairs of photons. Now, what's interesting about these photons is they're entangled because they're generated through the same process. And these entangled photons can be used as a resource for, say, quantum teleportation. Now, entangled photons, we might say, is an idea worthy of a Nobel Prize. So we're going to target in this talk specifically the conversion of microwaves to optical. In the Chi2 process, those frequencies don't necessarily have to be the same as they were in the frequency doubling. They can be different, in fact, vastly different. And that's what we're going to show here. Now, room temperature, because if you can work at room temperature, you don't have cryogens or laser cooling, your technical complexity goes way down, and it's a lot easier to work with. A lot of different groups have approached this problem through optomechanical systems, optomagnetic systems, and this one uses warm atoms. This technique was pioneered by the group of Professor Andal Narayanan in India, and it's this that we are extending upon in this research. So here's our experimental setup. At the center of it, we have a vapor cell of enriched rubidium-87 atoms, heated to 45 degrees Celsius. Now, inside a rubidium atom, there's a microwave transition at 6.8 gigahertz and an optical transition at 780 nanometers. Now this cell is placed at the center of a cylindrical microwave cavity that's tuned to this microwave transition in the atoms. So the TE011 mode interacts magnetically with the atoms. And we call this field our signal. Now, penetrating the optical cavity and vapor cell is a weak laser beam. It's about 80 to 100 microwatts. And this is locked to an atomic transition in the atoms. Now, because these atoms are thermal at room temperature, close to that, this transition is Doppler broadened by about a gigahertz. We're going to use this fact later in our experiments. Now, we'll call this field our pump. And when the pump, when there's no microwave present, the pump just kind of propagates through and it's slightly attenuated by absorption of the atoms. When the microwave is present, a nonlinear Chi-2 process begins, whereby these two fields combine to create a third field, which we call our idler. Now the idler and the pump propagate collinearly out of the cell and interfere with a local oscillator beam, and they interfere on a photodiode. We measure the beat signal on a spectrum analyzer. That's how we collect our data. So here's another way of looking at it. We have our signal, our pump, and these combine to give an idler. Now the width of this idler spectrum is very narrow. It's only a couple tens to hundreds of hertz. And so what we're going to do in these experiments that follow is we're going to modulate either the signal or the pump and see what happens to the idler. So it's good to note that when we take a wave and modulate it, we create sidebands in its spectrum, an upper and lower sideband in general. We're going to be using this fact in our experiments. So with the main scheme in mind, let's head to the lab. We have 3 experiments to look at, and for good measure, we'll bring our laser safety goggles just in case we need them. So the first experiment, we're going to amplitude modulate our signal, and this will create sidebands in its spectrum. Now these combine coherently with the pump to produce sidebands in the idler spectrum. And we can see that down here in our data. As we tune the modulation frequency, the sideband amplitude drops off, and we have about 500 kilohertz to work with. This is our conversion bandwidth. So what we've done here is we've taken a simple classical signal and we have transduced it to an optical signal 5 orders of magnitude larger in frequency. Okay, so in our second experiment, we are going to modulate our pump field with an electro-optic modulator. This creates sidebands in its spectrum, and it's equivalent to sending in laser beams of slightly different wavelengths simultaneously into the system. Now each of these will interact with a separate velocity class of atoms, and they'll combine with a signal to create their own corresponding idler peak. We can similarly tune this modulation frequency and sample different points in the Doppler spectrum. And here we can sample over a range of about 1 gigahertz and see this conversion. So this kind of tunability in a microwave to optical conversion process is really unprecedented. While we have really a narrow conversion bandwidth, we are able to extend that over a much larger range using the thermal motion of the atoms. In our third experiment, we're going to modulate both the signal and the pump at the same frequency. In this case, we're going to choose 50 kilohertz. In this case, the sidebands will overlap exactly with each other. And if we vary the relative phase between the modulations, we see that we can extinguish one of the sidebands or the other. And they're almost out of phase with each other. Overall, we have about a 96% maximum visibility difference. And what this does is it shows that our conversion process from our signal to idler is phase coherent, that we have faithfully transduced phase information over that process. Now, a common question we get is, what is the efficiency of this process? Now, we're still crunching the numbers. Those will come out very shortly. But based on what we know of our system and how that compares to other things, we expect to be in about the 10 to the minus 5, 10 to the minus 4 range. Now, this is clearly not good for quantum transduction experiments. There you need close to unit efficiency. But it is actually comparable with state-of-the-art work at microwave to optical conversions at room temperature. So we feel really encouraged by that. So in conclusion, we've shown microwave to optical conversion in a warm atomic vapor. We have a conversion bandwidth about 500 kilohertz, and this is tunable over 1 gigahertz. We've also confirmed the phase coherence of the input signal and output idler fields. Now, all of these experiments were done at steady state. In the future, one question we hope to answer is, what happens if we pulse either the signal or the pump? Now, based on previous theory and some initial tests we've done, we know that there is an anomalous delay in when the idler emerges from the system. And this is due to the nonlinear process. We're going to experimentally study this in greater depth. We also believe that we can enhance our conversion efficiency by interleaving an optical cavity over our microwave cavity. And hopefully there we can get better efficiencies. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your attention.